Okay, I'll start with something completely different, or almost completely different. The topic of the moment, in some respects, is abortion, which is a traditional conscience issue. I was listening yesterday to an interview with an American pro-life campaigner who was talking about how they should respond to the overthrow of Roe versus Wade. And it was interesting because he made the point that there are some people in the pro-life movement in the States who say that they should focus less on trying to make abortion illegal and more on winning hearts and minds, appealing to people's consciences so that they won't want to have abortions rather than just having the blunt instrument of the law. And this guy was very much against that line of thinking. He thought the law serves a purpose. He quoted Martin Luther King, who said, the law maybe can't make white people love me, but it can stop them from lynching me. And so there's that very pragmatic idea, we'll just stop abortion, use that. Which isn't to say that he didn't want to continue to make the argument, but then I think maybe because he'd taken that perspective, his advice for how to argue the case against abortion was quite legalistic in itself. He said, you don't need to talk about the Bible or anything like that, just keep it simple, it's a simple syllogism. To deliberately take an innocent human life is wrong. Abortion deliberately takes an innocent human life, therefore abortion is wrong. That's the syllogism to take out there. And a lot of people, if you say that, okay, yeah, it seems wrong to take an innocent human life, yeah, that's pretty much what abortion does. It's wrong. But where does that get you? As soon as you come in then to the real world and see a real-life case, and I'll unapologetically give the soft case of a teenage rape victim is compelled then to carry the child of her rapist, most people would feel a voice of conscience says, that can't be right. Some people will insist it is, but many people will say, no, that can't be right. And going back to the syllogism isn't really going to change their mind. Where you say, okay, well, this is a terrible situation for this young woman. She needs to be helped. But syllogism says no, so that's not going to be right. So I think that's there'll always be something which isn't reducible to syllogism in morality, a kind of a sentiment that that's wrong. And some people are content to say, no, come on, that's just completely wrong. In that situation, of course, abortion has to be allowed. Some people will go back to the syllogism and say, well, hang on, is it always wrong to take an innocent human life? And what do we mean by a human life? And some people will pick it apart and make a logical argument where they'll take apart that syllogism. But I think the point of conscience is that you don't actually have to do that. You might find yourself unable to argue with someone who's put up a logical argument, but you say, no, I just don't buy it, sorry, my conscience tells me something different. And I think that's an important principle, that you don't have to engage with arguments, you don't have to win the argument in order for your conscience to be respected. And it goes the other way too. I mean, if I will very briefly set out how I think the argument works for many people, most people have a sense that abortion is sometimes permissible, and sometimes not. A lot of people always want to find the middle ground. To the great frustration of those people on either side who say it's a point of principle, there's a tendency, people, if you look at the polls, people say, well, yeah, it should be allowed, but there's too many, or it shouldn't be like a form of contraception. There's always these kinds of attempts to rein things in. But if you have this idea, even if you take the idea of abortion, sometimes acceptable, sometimes not, how do you decide? Can you codify that in law? Well, it's very difficult to do that because you always think a case that doesn't quite fit into that tugs on people's conscience. So then what do you do? Have a committee of people to decide on a case-by-case basis of whether abortion is acceptable? Well, it doesn't sound very practical, and also it's a little bit abhorrent. It sounds a bit gross to have this committee deciding these things. And so we come down to this idea that someone's got to decide. Presumably it should be the pregnant woman. And that's more or less the consensus in those societies where abortion is permitted, even if some people continue to think that in some circumstances it's wrong. And that includes, of course, those American states that aren't planning to restrict abortion. But within that, it's kind of a fudge, and there's always going to be some people who will say, yeah, but it's still wrong at least some of the time. And we know that within the medical profession, there's an established principle that there is such a thing as a conscious exemption. If you feel that you don't want to have anything to do with this procedure, again, you don't have to win the argument and say this is why it's wrong. You can just say this feels wrong to me and I don't want to be involved. So that's, I think, an established way of thinking about how conscience operates on these kinds of moral questions. You're not compelled to go along with the prevailing orthodoxy, whether that's that abortion should be prohibited or allowed. Obviously, in those states where they are prohibiting it, you do have to go along with it for abortion. I won't get into the argument on that. To come to then conversion therapy then. James is an example of someone who's obviously, whose conscience told him that the orthodoxy in the field that he was working in is wrong, and who actually can make a very coherent argument about why that is, and take that up. And I think, the arguments for why conversion therapy should include trans do seem to me quite weak. I mean, I don't know if people want to bring them up. We can talk about that in the discussion. So what I want to do, if just for the sake of argument, is to consider the tougher argument. What about conversion therapy for homosexuality? Now, we can all agree that if there's coercion involved, physical force, that's a bad thing. But what about when people feel that it's something they want to go along with, that they want to get help on this issue? And, most of the world religions have always said that homosexuality is wrong. So we shouldn't be shocked that some people think that, even if we disagree. It's an opinion that's been out there for some time. I don't know what you all think individually, but I want, as a kind of thought experiment, to try and get out of the head of 21st century secular liberalism and the way we think of things. So just to take a completely different example, there's an old joke about Northern Irish atheists who's consistently asked, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Because those are the categories people think in. And he was like, well, no, atheist doesn't fit either of those. So take another example. What about someone who says they're celibate? Well, are you a straight celibate or a gay celibate? Now, in terms of our society, that's not a stupid question, because we assume that they have a sexuality and have decided not to go with it. But maybe it's not. Maybe someone would push back and say, "Well, no, I don't get involved in that stuff. Don't want to talk about it. Thank you." And then you might say, "Well, all right, so you're asexual, right? That's the category. We can tick that in the box." But maybe it's not that. Maybe if they're a Catholic priest, then presumably they're a heterosexual atheist. But it's probably not very helpful to think of yourself as heterosexual if you're trying to be celibate. So you might want to think of yourself differently and not assess people sexually whenever you meet them. That kind of thing. The thing that heterosexuals and gay people tend to do. So then let's take on then to another kind of type. What about the gay Christian or the gay Muslim? And obviously there are gay Christians and gay Muslims who are quite happy to be both, but the ones who stick with the orthodox teachings of those religions. Now, the orthodox way of thinking about it for us is, okay, well, that's just a gay guy who's got funny religious ideas that are causing all sorts of problems. Maybe he should be persuaded that he should just accept being gay. But again, getting out of that head, there are other people who think of it and say, well, no, he's just a good Christian or a good Muslim who's got sinful desires. And a particular kind of sinful desires, because they will always fall over themselves to say, look, it's not just homosexuality that's wrong. Any extramarital sex is wrong if you stick with the kind of really traditional religious views. So is it wrong then for someone to try and live out their religious beliefs by saying, okay, I have same-sex attraction, as a term that they use, but that doesn't define who I am, and I choose instead to get married to a woman and live a heterosexual life? Now again, the standard way we think about that is disaster. You're not only ruining your own life, you're ruining this woman's life as well. And maybe that's right, but again, thinking of it differently, and how it would be seen if you accept the categories of traditional religion, maybe it's not, because after all, what is marriage but an attempt to control your own sexuality? People don't get married because they think, well, I'm never going to fancy anyone else. They decide, well, I'm going to make a commitment. If I find myself my wandering eye, then I'll rein it back in, because that's what marriage is. It's commitment. Maybe that's unnatural. There always have been people who said, monogamy is just completely unnatural. It goes against our nature. This is an argument particularly favoured by philandering men, of course, who would justify it. It's just genetics. It's evolution. I can't help it. But we tend not to give particular respect to that. We just think, look, you're a dog. Can I get control of yourself? But, hang on, get control of yourself. Isn't that unnatural? I mean, it's the same. So we feel it's wrong to pick on homosexuality. But again, people say, well, what if it's not picking homosexuality? And again, even, take gay marriage. If someone engages in a gay marriage and then start to have heterosexual feelings somewhere down the line, should they then say, oh, well, I'm fixed? Most people think, no, well, hang on, if you take gay marriage seriously, then you've made a commitment there as well. But are you then living a lie? I think we're caught between this idea that our lives are to some extent something that we control, that we can have some say over, or against the idea that we're completely dragged away by our own feelings. So I just wanted to get you to think of it slightly differently in that way. Is it okay to try to restrain yourself, restrain your own nature, in a sense, in ways that others would argue are unnatural? Again, if you can leave aside the thing of picking homosexuality, obviously seems very much against the morality of our society, and probably that's a good thing. But I think it's important not to confuse a syllogism for morality again. And the syllogism in question here is that you are your sexuality. That the gay man who wants to have a heterosexual marriage, or the lesbian woman, or indeed the person who has heterosexual feelings within a gay relationship shouldn't follow that, is kind of countercultural. And I think that we have to have some room for countercultural thinking. Which means a tolerance of ideas that seem intolerant. I mean, that's a classic paradox, but I think if we are going to be tolerant, tolerance does mean tolerating intolerance. So, what does that mean about conversion therapy? Well, again, if it involves coercion, it's wrong. But if it involves someone talking to a priest or an imam and saying, I don't want to have these feelings, I acknowledge these feelings, can I live my life differently? I think we have to be big enough as a society to say, well, that's up to you. And maybe we think it's a mistake, but nobody has the right to impose a worldview on anyone else. Even what seems to us a very alien worldview, you can say, well, that's something from the past. But much of the world, people still feel that way. And I think if you do want to argue against it, you have to argue against it. And something like a law that says you're not allowed to talk about this. When you think about it, this has been the mainstream way of thinking in all the world religions for centuries. And now we're in a situation where it might be illegal for a priest to talk to someone about this and to say, yeah, you're right, you can live as not a gay man. You can control your sexuality or restrain it. Now, maybe it is completely mad, but I would say that human nature is a bit more fluid than we sometimes give it credit for. So I don't really have a conclusion here. I'm keen to see what you all think about it. I just want us to be able to see the two views. Yes, okay, here's a gay man with silly religious ideas, but maybe he's just a religious man who's got sexual urges he'd rather not have. Is that okay?